Michael? Michael?
Hey. Yeah, wait, what's going on, Ragnar?
You there?
Yeah.
So I just looked at my watch. We got to record another podcast.
Oh, damn. All right. Shoot, what are we going to do? Oh, man.
The thing is what I've been thinking about is like we've done so many podcasts in the last years, and it's getting a little boring just with the two of us. I mean, I like you know that, but it's getting repetitive and daunting.
Yeah, and plus, you can be pretty boring sometimes, so it helps to spice the relationship up. Yeah, let's mix it up a little bit. Let's bring a special guest in. How about our good friend from Innuendo Studios, Ian Danskin?
That's a good idea.
Hey, Ian, I didn't see you. Oh, look, hey, everybody, here's Ian. Holy moly.
You rang?
Hi, Ian.
Hello.
Yeah, what a coincidence that you're just here. Yeah.
Yes, in this indeterminate space between multiple worlds.
Exactly. Oh, that's a good segue into what we are talking about today, isn't it?
Oh, what are we talking about today?
I mean, you should know because, I mean, you suggested it.
How
about we talk about Riven today?
Ah, excellent.
That sounds like a good idea. No. So, yeah, hello, everybody. This is Blast from the Past with Michael and Ragnar, and today with Ian Danskin from Innuendo Studios. And for those of you who don't know Ian yet, well, Ian, who are you, actually?
Oh, I'm just this guy. I don't know. Yeah, I'm similar to Ragnar. I'm a games and other stuff video essayist on YouTube. My channel is called Innuendo Studios. If you've ever heard of me, I did some videos. I did a video about Phil Fish, and I did a video about Super Smash Brothers as spectator sport, and I did a 6-part series about Gamergate and Anita Sarkeesian and male entitlement in the games space.
All fantastic works. No, honestly, without blowing smoke up your ass or anything, I think Michael and I
please blow.
We're really both big fans of your work.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks very much.
All of us appreciate, kind of the more analytical take on looking at games and absorbing them as cultural artifacts. And, I think both of us think that you're a channel that does that very well. So we're kind of excited as three of us who kind of like come at games from a similar angle and a similar headspace. I think this is great. This is great stuff.
Thank you.
And for those of you who don't know Ian yet, there's a link in the description of whatever you're listening this podcast to, and you should absolutely check it out. And today we're talking about Riven, but because you cannot talk about Riven, which is the sequel to Myst, without talking about Myst, I'd say let's start talking about the original Myst. And there might be one person in this world who has never heard of Myst or doesn't know what it is. And for this one person, I'd say let's just really start at the bottom and explain what is Myst, actually. What is this game that came out in 1993 by Cyan Worlds? Michael, you want to explain it?
Yeah, so Myst is kind of an early graphic adventure game. I think a lot of them now, like maybe if you play hidden object games, this might be a familiar format to you. Myst was kind of really one of the proto early format of this, where you're kind of dropped into this 3D rendered world, and you have to kind of interact with the environment and solve puzzles through your interactions with the environment. And there's a lot of like environmental storytelling and emphasis placed on immersion and really kind of like making you feel that this is a whole and complete world. And it's important not to understate, just how popular and revolutionary Myst was. I think, up until The Sims was released, Myst was the best-selling computer game of all time. I mean, when I first played this game in 94 or 95, it was my grandparents had a copy.
Yeah.
Even my 60-year-old grandma at the time was getting into this interesting little game. It had such wide cultural reach. It was really a revolution.
It's a good comparison to The Sims, actually, because The Sims was so successful because it targeted everybody but and including the core gamers. But like, as you said, your grandparents played it, and everybody who was not the traditional gamer played it. And I think that was a thing for Myst back in the day because it looked amazing for the time. And it was like the game that you showed to people who had no idea about computers to say like, look how far computer graphics have gone.
Yeah, Myst was actually the killer app that got people to buy CD-ROMs when they were new.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was also one of the first CD-ROM games that used full motion video, which kind of launched one of the most beautifully ironic times in video game history because there was a lot of unintentional hilarity in there. But yeah, I wanted to ask, like, Ian, do you remember when you first played Myst and what kind of impact it had on you? And just tell us a little bit about it. And there must be something important about these games for you if you said immediately that you wanted to talk about them on the podcast.
Well, Myst is weird for me because, like, I've pretty much always, at least growing up, been lagging several years behind everyone else. So by the time I played Myst, everyone I knew had already played it. Like, it had crested in the public consciousness. Because, like, my computer, we didn't have a CD-ROM drive in my house until a few years after everybody else. And my family, like, bought me games, but they didn't exactly spoil me with games. So for Myst, it was like, I knew when I came to Myst, like, I knew I was a fan of adventure games. I knew adventure game fans loved it. So I think I just sort of liked it because I knew I was supposed to like it. But at the same time, like, one of the things that fascinated me was, like, the disc came with a behind the scenes on how the game was made, like just this little QuickTime file about how they made it. And I just remember being so fascinated with how they went about making this game because, like, what's interesting about Myst is how it's this very fantastical world. Like, you are transported to a world that would never exist in the real world, but is still recognizable. It has all these elements that you would recognize from the real world. Like Myst Island itself, this fantastic world you've been sucked into, is it's got like 5 different biomes on like one tiny island. It's like, oh, there's a redwood forest and there's a rocket ship and there's like there's like a lake section with a clockwork little structure, like a couple steps
a pirate
out.
ship.
Yeah, there's a pirate ship. There's like an underground section, and like a library, and it's just this big, like, dense mashup of different aesthetics and different environments. And it was the kind of thing that, like, you could really only render on a computer. Like, the idea of going to a world like this was not something you were going to see outside of maybe Disneyland. But it wasn't going to be as immersive because you'd know, like, oh, these are just actors or whatever. And I think that was really revelatory. Like, I mean, the way Myst got away with the level of graphical fidelity it did is that it was just made in HyperCard.
Right.
Right? It's like all they needed was just like screenshots of these rendered images. They didn't have to render any of it in real time.
So yeah, HyperCard was basically an interactive application that allowed you to add hotspots to photos or images to move further, and that's basically what Myst was built on. So as opposed to classical point-and-click adventures like in the typical LucasArts style, where you see like your character that moves around and you have like this visible inventory and the verbal menu and all that kind of stuff, Myst was played from the first-person perspective. It was really just like the original versions. The images you stood on were not even animated, were really just screenshots and a little bit of sound in the background. And sometimes you had like little areas that were slightly animated or something. And then you clicked certain hotspots to move forward or to turn around or to manipulate an object. That's basically how Myst is played. And it's different than adventures, the graphic adventure used to be at that time. And it's kind of a point where, at least in my experience, the adventure genre did a kind of a split, because there's the one arm that went down further down the LucasArts type point and click adventure rabbit hole, and then Myst basically was the catalyst for a genre arm of Myst-Likes, basically.
Yeah, Myst really, like, the game put so much emphasis on immersion at the time. Like, I think the idea was really that it was transporting you to another world, and that's how it was pitched in all the marketing material. And I think some of it looks like a little bit dated or a little antiquated today, but, you know, at the time they were doing some really revolutionary stuff in terms of computer graphics. Like, they would go out and you would have photographers and designers who would do real location scouting, just like you would do for a film, and you would take pictures of rock textures and wood textures, and then using Photoshop, which was a relatively new technology at the time, they would, you know, kind of convert that into an image or, you know, a texture or whatever that you would then see on the screen in front of you. And at the time, there just simply hadn't been anything like it. It was genuinely a revolution.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't paint Myst as like being the first game to do all of this stuff, because like the same year was actually, like, I think the original Journeyman project came out, and there were a couple other first-person games, but Myst was like such an event. Like so many people played it. So many people who had never played games before played Myst that like, you know, maybe that little fad would have burned itself out or something and we would have mostly honed down to third person adventure games.
True, yeah.
But Myst was such an event that it was like, oh, well, that's what we're doing now. And now people think of like, oh yeah, Journeyman Project, that's like Myst. I'm like, technically it came out first, but yes, there probably wouldn't have been sequels if not for Myst.
I believe one of the reasons why this came together, like this huge success in comparison to other, like to, for example, the Journeyman Project, was that Myst targeted the Macintosh, which at that time didn't have a lot of video games at all. And also the direction of Myst itself felt more like a game directed towards adults, as opposed to most video games were more, you know, targeted, like especially Nintendo and also PC games, of course, but often targeted at a teenage audience, like, you know, young boys and that kind of stereotype. And Myst had both the platform and the audience basically just for themselves. Like,
I mean, it's funny to think about because, like, if we think about our ages, pretty much all of us played Myst when we were definitely children.
yes.
But it felt grown up. It's like I was 9 years old when I played Myst, but I felt like, oh wow, this is like literate and thoughtful. Like the opening narration uses words like allayed, and I was like, oh, that sounds like a very grown up word.
You know what? Where you just mentioned the opening narration, because we're an audio medium, I would recommend that we just take a little bit of an atmospherical teaser and we just listen to the opening sequence to get the people an idea of how it feels like. And after that, we try to go a little bit into how the puzzles work and what the game tries to do, okay?
Do it.
Yeah, go for it.
I realized the moment I fell into the fissure that the book would not be destroyed as I had planned. It continued falling into that starry expanse of which I had only a fleeting glimpse. I've tried to speculate where it might have landed. I must admit, however, such conjecture is futile. Still, questions about whose hands might one day hold my Myst book are unsettling to me. I know my apprehensions might never be allayed, and so I close, realizing that perhaps the ending has not yet been written.
Ooh, shivers.
Absolutely. So what happened was, visually, we saw like a large fissure in a void of nothingness and a character with a book falling down into, you know, like this oblivious space, and this book really lying just in black space. And that's where Myst starts. You have this book, and the first interaction you do is you click this book, you open it, and then you see an animated picture of an island, like the iconic Myst Island, so to say. And
it does like a whole fly in, like you're on a helicopter or something, like doing this slow pan in on the island, very cinematic.
And as soon as you click this image on the book, you get like a sound suggests that you are being sucked into this book, and you suddenly find yourself in that reality on this island. And I think this is a good point to go into something I know Michael is eager to talk about, because there is something beautiful in this symbolic language that Myst, you know, proposes.
The use of books, it's so wonderful to me. I mean, one, just rewatching that intro, I love the kind of in media res beginning where like you're kind of jumping in right at the middle of a story because you hear the narrator, Atris, who is kind of talking about how, oh, I got pushed into a fissure and I lost my book, and you wonder like what happened? Was there some sort of struggle? Like, oh, who is this guy? And then, you know, it's just falling through this starfield and the book lands in front of you, the player, and like your very first interaction to enter this world is, you know, you have to open a book and read a book basically. And throughout the game, you know, there's lots of journals and kind of like, you know, environmental storytelling style little mini novels that you can pick up and read that talk about the different worlds and how they were created. And this guy, Atris, who you learn is kind of this like book writer basically, who, you know, spoiler alert, but he writes ages. Like you build worlds by writing them. And this guy has basically figured out this lost magical art of how to like summon a world into existence by writing it. And so the whole theme of this book is basically, to me, this wonderful tribute to the power of human imagination, how like just a book can literally transport you to another world. And that's kind of this whole undercurrent of Myst, that books are these portals to anywhere. And it kind of, to me, that speaks to how like computer games almost were situating themselves as this like logical evolution, like in the same way that books can take you to another world, so too can games in an even more complete and high definition and amazing sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I had a friend who described it one time as like Myst being an analysis of like computer culture's relationship to hypertext. Like this idea of getting, like, not just being able to interact with a computer, but actually getting absorbed into a computer. And like the thematic links between not just like, okay, so Myst is a very immersive game, and it's premised on the idea of these books that are so immersive you actually get sucked into it. And that, it wanted this first-person perspective where it's this 3D world, and like your character is not a character. It's what they called... Yeah, what is it? They called it at Infocom. They called the protagonist of Infocom games an Afghan cap, which is... I'm going to see if I can remember what all the words stand for. It's ageless, faceless... gender-neutral, culturally ambiguous adventure person.
Oh, Infocom. We need to do something on Infocom games in the future.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like you're basically... The idea is that you yourself have found this book and you have been sucked into this world. And I think that's what like the behind-the-scenes thing made so fascinating, is that it was these people making this game using all this new technology and like this stuff that, like no one was really using Photoshop, and building the island with these like grayscale maps where it was the lighter the gray was, the higher it would be, and like texturing the island that way. And it felt very much like, oh, these guys are Atris, right? Like they actually wrote this world and created it, and then put a story in it about a guy who wrote this world and that you entered it.
And Myst, and I think especially Riven, has a lot of moments where you feel like there are direct references to that idea, that you are in a world of creators and where they kind of subtly reference themselves, like a mild fourth wall break where it suggests that, yeah, this world was created by someone, and you all know who it is. Basically, it's the creators of the game. I at least replaying Riven, I felt that some of the, especially some of the parts, because you read a lot of journals in both games to suck up the story of what's happening there, and that's also an interesting aspect. So let's. You know what? Before we diverge too much, let's go through how the game actually works. Like, how do we play? How does it start out on the island? We already said that in the beginning, you see this book, you enter it, and then you find yourself on Myst Island. So how does it go on from there? Who wants to pick up? Michael?
Sure. So from there, you're in this first-person perspective, kind of wandering around this island, and slowly you begin to see, as Ian mentioned, there are all these different biomes, and it starts to become apparent that like each of these different biomes represents a different puzzle. And so initially you have to figure out how to unlock the book that is kind of the portal into whatever this world is. There's a spaceship that leads to a world that's kind of centered around electricity and physics, and there's a mechanical clock tower you can get into that leads to like a more mechanically focused world. Or there's a pirate ship that leads to like a sunken ship kind of world. And so you go and you kind of have to solve these environmental puzzles by interacting with the environment, and it's like and again, if you've played a hidden object game, you might be familiar with the format. You kind of hunt around the screen looking for switches or levers or something that kind of stands out to be interacted with, and that'll usually then change, the image on screen, making it look like some sort of motion or animation has happened, unlocking another part of the puzzle. And the whole game is basically kind of like proceeding through these hidden object, interactive puzzles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing that's important to distinguish here is that unlike in the classic LucasArtsy point-and-click adventures, you don't carry around any objects. Like, you don't have an inventory. Everything you do is direct manipulation of the environment.
Right.
I mean, there are technically a couple of objects that you can carry around, but you can totally see that it's not what the game is built around. Like, you have to find different pages to complete two different books where like two opposing characters are two opposing brothers are captured in, and you have to bring them back pages from these different worlds. And that's basically the objective that you have to find out first. Like, you have to get this idea of, what do I do even here? That's basically, I think, what most people ask themselves first when they start this game. It's like, okay, why am I here? And I think that's how everybody starts and how everybody is supposed to start out, by knowing nothing about it and by, walking around that island, clicking objects at random, reading through text that you can find and trying to make sense of it all. And I like to call this kind of storytelling, as opposed to, other games that tell a more direct narrative with characters talking and direct exposition and everything. I like to call this archaeological storytelling, because everything you learn in Myst is indirect, and you have to piece together the history behind it by observing, by reading the environment, by figuring it out on your own. And that's kind of...
Yeah, you get a little bit of direct exposition at the beginning and then a little bit at the end, but in between that, it's all entirely environmental.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess should we explain what the actual plot is?
That might be, yeah.
I think this game is old enough, and for those of you who are worried about spoilers, you might want to play this game first, because we're also going to talk about a couple of puzzles that are involved in these games, and we might spoil them too. So if you're like really spoiler afraid, then might want to play this first. So yeah, but gloves off. So yeah, talk about whatever comes to mind.
Well, it's just like when things begin, it's like you wander around this island for a little while and you make your way into a library, and there's these two books on, like, what's the plural of podium? Podiums or podia? Whatever. There's two books. Each one is on a podium. And one is red and one is blue. And each one has a page. Like, the red book has a red page next to it and the blue book has a blue page next to it. Mm-hmm. And when you put the page into the book that it corresponds with, same as the Myst book at the beginning, there's like a little window on the front page, and at first it's just static, but when you put a page in it, there's like a person there, and there's these two brothers, Cirrus and Akinar, who are trapped inside these books, and they're telling you need to go to each of these different worlds, ages that
yes.
are, like the books for these different worlds are in all these different places on the island, and they need you to travel to these worlds and bring back the appropriate color. Like, Cirrus is in the red book. He says, bring me back red pages. And when you put all the red pages in the book, I will be freed. I was trapped here by... Oh, who does he say he was trapped by? They each say they were trapped by the other one, or possibly they were trapped by their father. No, they killed their father.
Right.
And
That's
got
what they
trapped
say,
here
yes.
by the other brother. And so you sort of like decide which one of them you believe, and that's why, like, that gives you like a little motivation to go to these other worlds. You're like, okay, I'm going to travel to this world, and in each world I'm going to find one red page and one blue page, and I'm going to decide which one I'm going to bring back. And that's kind of like your motivation for doing anything in Myst. It's like, oh, there's a world to explore, and there's a very subtle excuse to be exploring it. And there's 5 other worlds, and each one, it's like, you're just going to travel around these worlds, and there's parts of them that aren't accessible, and you're going to make them accessible and figure your way around until you come on a page and then a book that will take you back to Myst. Those are the things you got to find, is which page you want to collect and where the book is that will take you back.
Exactly. And on your way towards these different worlds, and also in these worlds, you have to solve puzzles to get there. Because if you just had to, if there was just a portal, you travel over, get a page, then the game would be over in a couple of minutes. But in order to do that, you have to find different spots on this island. For example, like we said before, there's this big gear tower, for example. There is this spaceship, there's this giant clock tower, and they're closed up before. And then you have to find subtle hints about them. Those are mostly like numbers or little words. So just an example, one of the keys for the clock tower basically says 4:20. And then you have like 2 little wheels in front of that clock tower, and you pretty quickly find out that these wheels will manipulate the arms of the clock towers. And so those are the kinds of puzzles that you encounter. These puzzles are all tied into the world, and it's important to notice that they also kind of tell you a little bit about how this world works. How it has been conceived by the creator, by Atlas in this case, or by others who wrote these ages. And as soon as you, for example, solve this clock tower puzzle, you go into it, and there's another contraption with levers and gears, and you have to set like 3 different numbers to a certain combination, which is 2 to 1, by the way. And once you solve that, you get access to another book, and this book will link you to another age.
Yeah, you kind of have this hub world where all the books are located, and then each world that you go to has a kind of different puzzle in the biome. Like you have to, in the redwood area, you have to solve a little puzzle in a cabin, or you have to solve a puzzle with a spaceship and restoring power to it in order to enter that world. And I think one thing we should really drive home is that this probably, if you've never played Myst before, like this probably all sounds really complicated. It sounds like, oh, this would take so much time. And like it is in a sense, but also the game, Myst at least, is very much rooting for you. Myst is not interested in being like so overly complex that you're never going to be able to beat it. Like if you just kind of take your time and carefully observe the environment, there are always little kind of like hints and clues that are going to lead you in the next place you need to go and give you the information you need to succeed. Myst wants you to succeed. It's not trying to see you fail.
Yeah, I mean, Myst, at the same time, though, like Myst is a game that like 10 million people bought and probably most of them never finished.
True.
But people didn't mind because like it was a world that just felt good to be in.
Yeah.
Like if you want to skip ahead a bit, like when you beat the game, there's no end game. Your reward for finishing the game is now you can wander freely through all the ages. And like that's
right.
it just feels good to be there. And sometimes it doesn't matter if you're not making forward progress.
Is that a little bit of this, like when people, for example, play a round of Skyrim, not to, level up your character or do a couple of quests, but just to wander around in this beautiful landscape. And Myst was basically one of the very early games that gave you this feeling of, it's really just nice to walk in this virtual world. Yeah, that's...
Soak up the sights, yeah.
One thing I definitely wanted to mention, connecting to what Michael said before, one observation that I made, because I replayed Myst a couple of days ago, and it was the first time I finished the game in, I would say, around 15, 20 years, a long time. And I remember that I played it when I was a child, and because it had this very eerie, earnest feel to it, I was actually afraid of this game. Like, this game kind of scared me. It scared me not in a jump scare horror sense, but when I played it, I was intimidated by it in some way, because it felt so... It felt... It's hard to put my finger on it, but I
there's something very mournful about it. Like, I think you're really hitting on something there. Like, and even in all how these worlds are designed, like they all they feel barren because you don't really interact with any other players except through books. You see other people inside these books, but otherwise there are no real other like people to interact with. And you kind of get this sense that like, oh, I'm kind of wandering through these like barren ruins of a world that once was. And like there used to be some sort of civilization here, but there's not anymore. And it really does give you that archaeologist feel. But there is something very kind of like lonely and isolating. And in that sense, it can feel like a little bit intimidating and eerie, because you feel like I'm kind of just wandering through this ghost world. Like, what was here before? What is this mystery I'm trying to unlock?
True.
Yeah, it's a very like explorative game, but it's also a very lonely game.
I mean, it was inspired by Jules Verne's Mysterious Island, which is also where it gets the title from. And the setup or the setting of this novel is basically somebody strands on a lonely island and discovers a lot of weird and strange mechanical contraptions. So you definitely see where the inspiration is coming from. But what I wanted to get to is, like, I was intimidated by the game's feeling, but also by the puzzle, because being like an adolescent, these puzzles were overwhelming for me. I was used to, these more funny, tongue-in-cheek puzzles, like, take a monkey as a wrench to fix a pump in Monkey Island 2 or something.
I hate that puzzle so much.
Yeah, think about it. I played Monkey Island 2 in another language, and this is a pun on words, because there is no monkey wrench in my native language, and there was no way to figure that out except for trial and error. But okay,
well, for what it's worth, Ragnar, I solved that puzzle in English, and I only solved it by using everything on everything, and even then I couldn't tell what he was doing with the monkey. It just seemed like he was sort of humping it a little bit, and then suddenly a waterfall disappeared.
Exactly.
So you had the same experience as the rest of us.
So this is not how Myst puzzles work, but they're very logical. They're grounded in science usually, and for somebody who was like maybe 12, 13 years old, this was intimidating, and for me this game felt almost unsolvable. It took me weeks or months of regular coming back to the game to solve it, and I remember it being this gigantic unsolvable puzzle game that is so incredibly hard. That's how my memory stored Myst. And when I now came back to it and replayed it, I was prepared to pull out a walkthrough so I can finish it in time. And I ended up finishing it in like 4 hours. And I realized it is really not a difficult game at all. It is very logical, very approachable, and I even found it kind of easy and obvious. And I didn't remember those puzzles. So
there are a few puzzles that are kind of cheap. But the rest hold up, I think.
Yeah, one of the puzzles that I think Michael and I talked about before that we both needed a walkthrough for was on the Selenitic Age, I think that's what it's called.
The
rocket ship age. Yeah, there's this underground tunnel system that you have to drive through with your cart. And basically the trick there is that in another age you heard a couple of sounds, like really arbitrary sounds, like a ping, a pong,
trickling water,
exactly. And these sounds are associated with cardinal directions, but you had to remember that.
Yeah, I will totally eat crow on this one, because in the run up to this podcast, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to replay Myst, and I remember playing it so many times when I was younger to the point where I could damn near speedrun it. Like I really knew all those puzzles inside and out. So I really thought like, all right, I bet you I'm going to be able to beat this game without needing to go through a walkthrough at all. And I almost did it. Until I made it to the rocket ship age, and I was having like flashbacks to what the first time I beat that puzzle when I was a kid, because the very first computer I played it on didn't have a proper sound card.
Oh no!
So I'm not sure how I did it, but I think I must have had to like brute force it. And like I remember like some 4-hour marathon session it took me to actually beat that puzzle. And that one is.
I never figured out the rule to that puzzle. I always solved that by brute forcing.
Interesting.
Like I actually think I ended up drawing out a map. And just taking every passageway and marking off where the dead ends were until I finally made it to the end.
Oh my god. Yeah, it really is just, there are 4 different sounds. And when you hear this sound, when you hear like the bing, that's north, you have to turn your card towards the north exit, and that's the next direction. And sometimes you hear like 2 sounds at the same time. Maybe if it's a bing and this spring sound is, then it means northeast, basically. That's how this works. But this is the kind of puzzle philosophy behind Myst, because a lot of these puzzles are, they're very logical, basically. You always have to understand the idea and language behind it, and then it's easily solvable. Then it's no big deal at all.
They always have an internal coherence. Yeah.
That's I always had this question about the puzzles in Myst and Riven, which is like, I partly because I've known the solutions to them for most of my life at this point. Like, I don't know if the puzzles are fair or not. Because, like, especially, like, in Myst and even more so in Riven, there's puzzles where it's like, if you pay attention to the sound, or if you pay attention to things that most games don't train you to pay attention to, the solution is actually pretty straightforward.
Yes.
And I was trained on these, like, LucasArts adventure games where, like, not only, it's like the puzzles always sort of declare like, hi, I'm a puzzle. and you always know like what is puzzle and what is environmental storytelling, what's a puzzle and what's flavor text, what's just like throwaway lines. And in Myst and especially Riven, like there really isn't a line between that. It's
That's
like
true.
the environment is the puzzle. Like environmental storytelling are the puzzles. And so there's these things where it's like after, in retrospect, you're like, oh, if I just paid attention to the sound, I probably would have figured that out. And it makes a certain internal sense. But I couldn't tell if it's like, is the only reason I didn't notice the sound because all the LucasArts games I've played, if you needed to pay attention to something other than just like graphics or text, it would like point out like, oh, maybe you should listen to the audio a little bit. There's this distinctive noise. And like there were all these times, especially when I played Riven, where I was like, no, that's clearly not a puzzle, because if it was a puzzle, it would clue me in that it was a puzzle. Yeah, and like now I'm like, well, now I'm spoiled because now I know the solutions. I don't know what it's like to play these games having not played an adventure game before, which realistically most of the people who played it hadn't, because adventure games were like they were like this niche thing, and there were no adventure games that sold 10 million copies the way Myst did. So most people were new to the genre, and they were taking this stuff as like, well, why wouldn't you pay attention to the sound? You know, it's like, why would I pay attention to this and not that? And I'm like, well, because I don't know, 6 years of playing adventure games told me to.
Mm-hmm. There's certainly
like,
something that makes like it's just like when you watch a lot of movies and you learn about certain storytelling patterns that you can sometimes telegraph things that are happening, and you're often right, and people are like, well, how do you know this stuff? And that's kind of similar with adventure games in this sense, because older LucasArts games, I know that it took me and my friends months to finish them, and when I play one today, I just know the rules and I know what to pay attention to, so they're kind of easy. But what you just said, like, the only angle I can give on that is somebody who has experience with adventure games, but who doesn't remember the puzzles of both games, because I replay them both, and I must say, Myst, from my perspective, felt incredibly fair, and I was even surprised by how easy it is. And Riven, we're going to talk about Riven in a little bit, but that's kind of a little segue into this.
Might be a good segue.
There's something I want to talk. I want to mention about Myst before like as a first, like Riven, the inevitable sequel to Myst, is a lot bigger and more vast in the way the worlds are built. You have to traverse a lot more space, and that's what makes part of some of the puzzles really difficult, to the point of tedium. Like I remember, just as an example, I remember there was one puzzle where you had like a set of marbles that you have to arrange in like in like how do you call this? Like there's this little board where you put the marbles in, and you had to put it in exact positions, and
Right, it's like a grid, but this is like a 20 by 20 grid, and you have a handful of colored marbles that you have to arrange on this 20 by 20 grid. So, it's not the sort of thing that you can guess at. Like, this is a very complicated puzzle that, requires a precise solution.
Billions of different combinations, so you have to know why you put these marbles in which spaces. And the solution to it you get from an island that's really far away and that needs you to ride a tram. So it takes like 1 or 2 minutes at least, if you know where you're going, to get there. And then you even have to figure out, is that maybe the right, is this maybe the right answer? So you travel back and you try it out, and then you get like, okay, it doesn't work, but it doesn't give you any hint as to what if your idea was right and what wasn't. So this is all very cryptic. So you needed to find out how to relate the information on one island super far away to a massive grid on the other end of the game. And that made a lot of puzzles harder than they are in like arbitrarily, or it was kind of a cheap difficulty to me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so
I mean, that's another puzzle where, like, I don't know whether or not it's fair because I've known the solution since I was 15.
Yeah.
I would argue that is one of the puzzles that had me really enraged because I was like, okay, I'm going to try this out again. And it took me a couple of hours and it didn't feel fair. It felt, if all these objects would have been on the same island and it allowed me to, try around a little bit more, then it would have been fair. But this vast distance that you have to travel in between, that made it really unapproachable, and that made it very tedious to try out ideas, which is basically what Myst and Riven are for. You experiment, and there's no fail state or anything. You should be rewarded for trial and error, but in this case you aren't, because every trial that ends in error means, you got to travel back there again. And at some point, even the nice landscapes don't cut it out anymore. It gets tedious. But all right, okay.
I confess I kind of love that puzzle, but we can get to it later.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, cool. We already mentioned a little bit of Riven, the sequel. There's one thing I wanted to mention about Myst before we move on, because we said all the interactions with the characters are in what I like to call strikingly mediocre green screen acting. When you open these books and you see these windows and there's like Akana and Cirrus and they talk to you and they're like, bring me blue pages between static and everything. There's this charm to it that has become an iconic staple basically of the Myst and Riven series, and later on also to other Myst-likes, I would say. There are a lot of games that try to incorporate these green screen full motion video sequences in it.
Wing Commander, Command and Conquer.
Yeah. Journeyman Project.
Yes.
It's basically
and Gabriel Knight 2.
Oh my god.
Oh yes.
My god. Yeah.
Phantasmagoria.
Phantasmagoria. There, we wanted to do something on that. I remember.
Perhaps.
Who knows?
Good. Let's put that one in our back pocket. Yeah.
I will sit that one out.
Okay, I understand that. But yeah, another thing that the developers of Myst try to do with it is offer you some sort of moral choice in there, because there is not technically there's not just one ending, but in the end it kind of tests how well you listen to these characters in there. So does someone want to spoil what's up with that?
Sure. So at the end, you find out that Cirrus and Akanar have kind of rebelled against their father Atris and tried to steal his power. They wanted his power to like create and control these worlds. They want it for themselves, and so they've locked their father inside this prison book. Inside, I think it was the very first age he wrote, Dunny. And so they've got him trapped inside his world now, and they're trying to. But as they trapped him, he pulled one over on them because he saw how dangerous his sons were, and so he locked them away. So throughout the game, you're gathering these pages to kind of like reconstitute the red or blue books for Cirrus and Akanar, and eventually they lead you to the place where their father Atris is imprisoned. He's not actually dead; he's imprisoned in this first age he wrote. And so Atris gives you kind of like the real scoop about what's going on, and then you're presented with a final choice. You can get the page to unlock his book and free him, or you can take the final page to either Cirrus or Akanar. Now, yeah, spoiler, if you go to either of the brothers, of course, they obviously betray you. As Ragnar has been saying, like, if you have paid attention to like the clues here, obviously these guys are not trustworthy. They're not good people. Like, you really want to go with the dad in the end. If you go with either of the brothers, they trap you in their book, and it's like, aha, they're free to, wreak havoc. Or if you go with the father, he kind of, what does he do at the end? He doesn't burn. Does he burn their books? Like trapping them there forever? Yeah, he burns them. Yeah, he traps his sons there forever, and then kind of offers you a way to like, here, you're finally free to go, but I may call on you again, friend. Who knows when I'll need you again. But for now, enjoy your time here, explore the island at your leisure.
That's actually
and that's
the
just
first
kind of this
time you directly interact with. You are directly in a room with another character, which is Atris in this sense.
Yeah.
In this old age, which is like a dark room where he's sitting at a wooden table and writing. There are a couple of old books and everything, and he's in this room, and I actually only saw it in the... there are a couple of versions of Myst. Like, there's a Myst original version, there's the Masterpiece version. There are two fully 3D rendered versions that came out later, and I saw it in the real Myst, which is like the 3D version, which also looked pretty interesting. But I was surprised, like, how well this was actually made for the time, because most of the full motion video looked super cheap, but that was one of the best scenes in the entire movie. That looked super coherent. There was really good green screen effect, and even the acting was, for the time, for video games, very convincing, I guess.
Yeah, for years, like the brothers are really overacting,
Yeah.
but at the same time, like compared to where full motion video went, they looked so restrained.
Aren't the brothers Rand and
Yeah.
those
So
are
the
the
creators
developers,
of Myst
Rand and
are
Robin Miller.
Rand and Robin Miller.
Yeah.
And they play
Yeah.
Cirrus and Akinar, and Rand also plays Atris.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
And that's the point, you know? Atris then, you know, you are in this age, and he goes back into Myst, and he burns the book with his sons in there, like, whoa. He comes back, and he says, like, okay, everything is fine, we don't need to fear them anymore. This is where the game ends, and as Ian said earlier, your reward is basically, okay, you can go back to Myst now and explore it at your own leisure. But a couple of years later, Riven came out, like the long anticipated sequel to Myst. And as we said, Myst came out in 1993, and it was 1997? Yes, 7?
Yeah.
97.
When Riven came out, and it was at the time one of the most highly anticipated games ever to date. Myst was an enormous commercial success. It had been launched on the Macintosh, but it had been ported to, like, I wouldn't even be surprised if it is like the most ported game after Doom. Like, I would
Yeah,
make
they-
that statement.
My friend played that game on the Saturn.
Yeah, Sega Saturn. There's PlayStation. There's the 3DO. There's Windows, obviously. The Jaguar, CDI, Amiga
Oh my God,
OS,
yeah.
PlayStation Portable, and so on and so on. It keeps going on. Like, there are still modern ports to iOS, Android, and so on. Even the Nintendo DS has a version of Myst. So this
Damn.
game has been on every system, and it's kind of like this in-joke with Doom ports, when it's like, you know, you have a refrigerator display, and it's like, I'm going to play Doom on that. And you can basically do the same thing with Myst. And of course, the world was waiting for what Cyan Worlds or Cyan Inc. Would do next. And they tenfolded the budget they put into Myst and worked for 4 years on the sequel, Riven. So
Yes.
that's,
So-
yeah. Ian, please.
I have a question. Before we talk about Riven,
Yes.
do y'all want to hear some lore?
Yes.
Hell yes.
Okay. So, of the people on this podcast right now, I am the only one who has read all 3 of the Myst books.
I've read one of them.
Which one did you read?
The Age of Tiana, I think it was.
Oh, Book of Tiana?
Book of Tiana, yeah.
Cool. So, all right, I read a synopsis of them. I'm mostly going to talk about Book of Atris, Book of Tiana, because Book of Dunny is not really relevant to the games very much. It takes place after them, and it's not very good. Arguably, none of them are any good, but they were great when I was in middle school.
So for people who are wondering, by the way, there have been, just so everybody knows, there have been 3 novels in the Myst universe that have been released, I think, between Myst and Riven, right?
I think Book of Atris came out between the 2. I'm not sure when Book of Tiana came out, but Book of Dunny came out after Riven. I know that.
And that's what we're talking about here right now, just for exposition.
And they basically fill in, like, Book of Atris and Book of Tiana fill in the backstory before Myst. So, like, I will try to get through this as quickly as I can.
No,
But let's see.
we have
Let's see what I
time.
can do. So, okay, first to correct Michael just a wee bit, Atris did not write Dunny. Dunny is actually where the people who, like, learned this art of writing books and creating them, that's like their
That's
point
right,
of
that's
origin.
right.
That's like the original civilization.
The first stage. Yeah.
And Book of Tiana basically tells the story of how Dunny fell. And like, it's super complicated, but basically it's Tiana was this just regular human woman who stumbles into this society and falls in love with a man there. And then that society, which like writes all of these worlds and everything, and they travel to all these ages, and it's amazing, wonderful, hooray. It gets wiped out by a plague.
Oh, no.
And Tiana escapes with her child. And so Tiana is like, she's a normal human. She's got a half Dunny child that she had with this man from Dunny. And she raises him by herself. And then when he gets to a certain age, his name is Gen. And when he gets to a certain age, he goes back to Dunny, goes to the ruins of Dunny to like try to excavate it and see like, okay, this plague wiped these people out, but did any of them survive in other ages? And he like teaches himself the art of writing these books. And he wants to bring back the Dunny civilization. And somewhere along the way, he picks up a woman that he falls in love with, and he fathers a child, and that's Atris. And he's just like, he's kind of a dick. And he brings Atris to Tiana and is like, you raise him. I don't want to deal with this because, you know, my wife is dead. I'm sad. I don't want to be a dad.
Yeah, Gen is really this kind of like perfect, overbearing, Freudian, disapproving father figure. Like, he's really ultimate villain in that sense.
So he shows up back in Atris's life after like Atris has grown to a certain age, being raised in like a cleft in the cliff by his grandma. It's like just him and his grandma in a cave. And Gen shows up and's like, hi, I'm your dad. You're like 15 or whatever. I'm going to take you back to Dunny and I'm going to teach you how to write ages. Because he's self-taught himself how to do it. And so he brings Atris down. He's teaching him all this stuff. And like Atris has a total knack for writing these ages. But the thing that he slowly discovers is that Gen's deal is he thinks, well, because I write these worlds, I am the god of the people who live in these worlds. And that becomes this big point of contention. Like some people in the Dunny civilization believed that, and I think that's part of why like the plague was a manufactured plague that these people wrote because they thought Dunny was corrupted,
decadent,
and there's this
like
there's this whole
shit,
like
yeah,
and there's this whole like tension of like, okay, are we gods or are we not gods? Should we live as gods? Should we demand that these people worship us? And Atris is like, no, we totally can't do that. And Gen is like, yes, we totally should. And Atris is like, well, screw you. I'm gonna get out of here. And he goes to Gen's fifth age, which is called Riven. And he lives with the people in Riven for a while. And he falls in love with a woman there. And he just
Catherine.
Yeah, Catherine, or her actual like Rivenese name is Catran, and Catherine is just the best he can do with it. Tiana's real name is actually Anna, and it's just the Dunny couldn't pronounce Anna, so they called her Tiana.
That's a difficult name.
Yeah, Anna, right? You definitely, if you can say Tiana, you can't say Anna.
Exactly. I never thought about that. That's cool. All right, go on.
So then he's in Riven for a while, and he's like, Gen thinks he's a god of these people, and Catherine is like raised to believe that he's a god, and he discovers that like he believes, and everyone else believes, that only the Dunny can write these books, but he discovers actually Catherine has learned the art as well, and she's written books of her own. And he's like, I've got it. We're going to escape together, and we're going to trap Gen here so that he can't mess with any of these other ages. And so one of the things is Gen is not actually a very good writer, and
right.
Riven is falling apart. And so there's this fissure that has opened up that just has this star field in it. It's like this big canyon in the ground that has a star field that seems to leak into another age, but no one knows where it goes or where it leads. And so they get this idea of like, okay, we're going to burn all the linking books out, because that's another thing about the art is when you go into this, when you touch your hand to the page of the book and you travel to this world, the book stays behind. So unless you bring another book with you, you can't get back.
Right.
But then when you come back, you leave that linking book behind. So it's like, it's impossible to go back where you came without leaving a doorway to where you came behind. And so they get this idea of like, we're going to burn all the linking books. We're going to go to this island of Myst that Catherine wrote. And then I'm going to link to Myst while jumping into the star fissure. And the book will fall and Gen won't be able to go after it. And that's how they like, Gen thinks he's a god and that's wrong. And he needs to stop subjugating all these people. So we're going to escape to Myst, and the last book out of Riven will disappear with us. And apparently that star fissure links into our world, and that's how we come into contact with Myst. Boom! That was fast. I got through the lore quickly.
Nice. And that's interesting because that's a point I wanted to talk about, that I wasn't like, with Myst, it felt totally like we're coming into this world from our, Earth, meat space, whatever.
Meat space, yeah. Away from keyboard.
Exactly. And with Riven, I had the feeling, because the whole lore around it got a lot more granular and fleshed out, that it moved a little bit away from this idea of you are someone coming in there from our world. But it's interesting that you mentioned that this rift is actually supposed to build like a gateway or an interface between those two worlds through which we enter it. That's interesting because you just answered a question that I wanted to ask later. So thank you for that. That's bad puzzle design in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think the difference in tone is kind of apparent right away, like at the beginning of Riven, because you kind of like, it opens up on Atris in his study and he looks at you like, old friend, good to see you again.
Yes.
You know, like you're no longer just kind of like this bit player who's happened to stumble into this world. Like Riven is definitely a capital S sequel. Like it's bigger, there's more stuff, there's more acting, there's more action. And like you yourself now are kind of like, you know, you have become a character, a fixture in this world. You're like part of the lore now. You're no longer just this outsider who stumbled into it.
Yeah, and I must say that Riven's story in many ways felt planned all along. Like even when Myst was out, like Myst starts with this rift seen from below and the silhouette of a man falling into it. And that rift scene is never really addressed in Myst itself, but it's part of what you uncover in Catherine and Atris's writing in Riven. So when they had their big falling out with Gan near the end, that kind of marks the ending of the story of Riven. That's kind of a really nice duology that goes full circle, because you have no idea what this rift means in Myst, at least as far as I remember. And you learn all about that in Riven. But since it has been there, it really felt like it wasn't constructed, or it wasn't written later on, but it felt like they had this whole idea about the story all the time, and Myst was just the setup.
Yeah, I think actually, I think the Millers are on record having said that they conceived of the plot of Myst, Riven, and the Book of Atris all in one go, and then realized it was too big for one game. So
that's how it felt playing Riven. That a lot of the stuff that's in Myst that's never explained in Myst on its own gets brought back, and suddenly things are making sense. Suddenly this rift scene at the beginning of the first game that gets never explained in Myst, it suddenly starts making sense, and you know, that's the character who's fought. Okay, now I get it. But it really felt planned all along, and that's kind of bold, because I mean, Myst could totally have been a commercial flop, you know. I kind of like this narrative boldness they went with, but yeah, and then Riven starts, and Riven starts right where Myst left off, basically in the same room. And as Michael already said, like, old friend, I need your help again. And then this whole story with Gen on Riven. By the way, Riven, you said the age of Riven, right? It is meant to fall apart at that time. Is that where the name comes from? Because Riven is kind of rive in past tense. Is that supposed to?
I think that's got to be intentional.
It's been torn apart.
Okay, cool. So yeah, how do we start out in Riven? What happens? Who wants?
I can take this one. So the premise of Riven is basically, so in the time since like the end of the Book of Atris, but before Myst begins, you know, like Atris and Catherine, they make a home on the island of Myst that Catherine wrote, and they have a couple of kids, and Atris just trying to raise them right, because he's like, no, I'm not going to be like Gen. I'm not going to tell these kids that they're gods. And then they decide, you know what? It would be cool if we were gods after all.
Little interjection here. Have you ever wondered where they live? Because there are no habitable buildings on Myst whatsoever. Like everything is just purely functional. There is no kitchen, there is no toilet, there is no nothing actually.
Maybe they go to the other ages to eat?
Maybe they have like a toilet age.
They had a very nice appointment on the ship before it sank, you know. I think that's
that's probably
the key we're missing.
Okay. Good. Go on.
And somewhere along the way, I'm not sure it's ever explained. I think it maybe technically, like in real Myst, there's a secret age that explains how Catherine ended up back in Riven. But like Catherine is from Riven, and somewhere along the way, Atris's sons trick her into going there. I think they like build some viewer that shows her a window into Riven and convince her that like her family is in danger. And so she goes to help them, but she doesn't have a linking book with her because they don't want to take any linking books to Riven because then Gen might get back. And also Riven is falling apart. So Atris is just like sitting here furiously writing in the Riven book, trying to like keep it from falling apart. And he says, okay, here's the deal. Now that you have shown up in my life, I finally have a person who can go into Riven to get Catherine back. I'm going to give you, I can't give you a linking book out, but I can give you a book that looks like a linking book and is actually a prison book. And if you give that to Gen, he will try to escape Riven by using this book, and he'll get trapped. And then you'll have to send me some sort of signal that I can see from like the little viewer window, and I'll come and get you. And that's like the premise is you're going to this, it's just one age, one gigantic age.
Oh, yes.
Where there's an entire civilization of people that worship Gen, and Gen has been trapped there for so long, he's like, well, might as well like settle in on being a god to these people. But it's also like, it was originally, I think, one island, and then it broke into 5 islands, and then the islands have drifted farther and farther apart from each other. So there's all these like ways of navigating them that don't work anymore, and you have to like either repair or get working again because no one's been using them for a long time.
And that's
and
also
your goal is to like
go on.
Well, your goal is just to find Catherine and trap Gen and then get out.
Yeah, that's the basic premise. And what you just said, like this time it is basically just one age. I mean, you travel to different mini ages in between, but this island of Riven is basically where 95% of the plot or even more takes place. And it's instead of in the first game it were, you know, different ages you travel to and solve puzzles, here you have like these different islands on which you travel. And I think that's also a sign where the developers wanted to show their extra budget and the technological advancement that happened in the couple of years, because you can, like some islands you just traverse on a bridge. Okay, so that's a couple of screens. But some of these islands you reach, for example, by a really impressive, like it still looks good, like a maglev train that is, you know, attached to a rail above you. And you really, it's basically like a roller coaster ride from one island to the next, and it goes through tunnels with light effects and underwater, and you drive through these. Yeah, it's really like a roller coaster to arrive at the other island. And they totally could have saved all that work by having maybe a linking book to the other island or some teleport or anything, but they really wanted to show off, like, listen guys, Myst, that looked cool back then, but you haven't even seen what we are really capable of. It still looks like showing off. Like,
yeah, it really, I mean, Riven is very, like, visually sumptuous. You know, you can tell that they almost treat it kind of like, okay, Myst was the proof of concept, now we've got the budget, and we're going to have a huge team behind this. Like, Riven really feels like we're taking this initial kernel of an idea, and we're blowing it up into, like, a big, big experience. Like, it is, you can tell that, like, the quality of the visual presentation and all of these little details and flourishes, it's, like, so magnified and so much bigger than Myst. It's really something.
This game is 20 years old. It's actually 20th anniversary right now, and it still looks really good. I mean, of course, that is because it's pre-rendered. You know, it's not real time. That makes it visually striking. But just imagine a game that is 20 years old and still looks visually really appealing and good. How amazingly mind-blowing this was in 1997, when all the other games looked like nothing compared to the visual fidelity of a Riven. That's basically what I wanted to say.
Yeah, it made my computer chug.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't watch any of the videos, like, dropped frames frantically. Like, the audio would clip in and out, and I'm like, well, whatever, it's still pretty.
Exactly, yeah. So what did you want to say before I interrupted you? I apologize for this.
I forgive you, Ragnar.
Thank you.
Well, like, it's not just that, like, the graphical fidelity and the scope is bigger. It's also, like, what made the design of Myst interesting is also really ramped up. Like, if you ask somebody how many puzzles are in Myst, like, you could be like, oh, well, let's see, there's the one where you have to, like, add up voltages, and there's the one with, like, little gears, you have to pull levers, and, you know, there's the one where you're navigating the tunnel.
I think it's
then
not more than 15 puzzles.
Right. But if you ask someone how many puzzles are in Riven, I think you'd be like, I guess there's 3. Like there's the Star Fissure puzzle, there's the Moiety Age puzzle,
Yes.
and then there's the Fire Bead puzzle. And like basically everything else is just traversing the space. It's like, oh, you have to pull this lever to bring this bridge down, or like, oh, you rotate, you like sneak under this door and you can pull this other lever. But those puzzles are just like really, really big and really deeply, like there's this term that some adventure game designers use, which is embedding, which is like, how deeply is your puzzle embedded into the narrative?
That's basically what Riven
like,
is about, or Myst and
yeah,
Riven
like
are
you can play
about.
a game like Machinarium, where like it's a super adorable game, but it's like, okay, there's just going to be like little back of your cereal box logic puzzles that are very barely justified by the story, and like it's fine. It's like it's charming the way it goes about it, but Riven is like the polar opposite of that. It is like there is not a single piece of information that you get to help you solve a puzzle that isn't also like enriching your understanding of the world. And the puzzles are not even so much like, oh, you have to solve this puzzle to progress. It's like, well, it's more like when you you are just given stuff that you don't understand, and when you understand how this world works, that stuff ceases to be a puzzle.
Yes, exactly. And they basically, what you said, like they embraced this general idea of what Myst was about, which I called archaeological storytelling before, and they went haywire with it. So, for example, my best example for this one is in terms of like this is really being an archaeologist, because the number system. The first time one of these games introduced a number system that you had to learn, meaning you read different text and you see these symbols, and after a little bit of judging from the context, you realize, okay, those are numbers, but you have no idea what kind of numbers they are. And the way you learn this number system is that in one of those villages on one of these islands, you enter something which is obviously a schoolroom. And in this room, there's a little mechanical gambling game, sort of. It's a wooden contraption where like 2 wooden people are hanging upside down on a little thread. And at the bottom, you see this giant fish head protruding, like that wants to eat them. Like they're being sacrificed to a fish god or something. And every time you press a button, and every time you do that, this apparatus, this fish head, moves beneath the other little wooden figurine, and you can hear a ball spinning inside, basically like a little invisible roulette table. And every time this ball stops, it shows you a random number, but a number in this Rivenese number system. And according to
It's actually the Dunny numbering system.
Oh, okay.
Aha.
Right.
Because, of course, Gen teaches the kids his own people's language, not their own language.
Dunny is like the...
Interesting commentary on colonialism there. I don't know if we want to get into that right this second, but the Riven has got those themes, man.
And Dunny is like, that's written D''N''Y. That's Dunny, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and what happens there is like every time you see that number, one of these wooden figurines gets lowered down in steps and is as many steps as the number shows. So, but what you basically do, like you play this game over and over again, and you write down these little symbols, and then you count how many times this little figurine gets lowered down, and then you say, oh, this is a 3. Okay, I got this one.
And it's like there's this little children's toy that's teaching you the numbering system of this whole world. And that's exactly what you were talking about, Ian, how like the puzzles and the story the game is trying to present you are just so tightly woven into the environmental presentation itself that it almost ceases to become a puzzle, because it's just kind of part of the story. And that is something that that Riven did pretty well. That and huge amounts of reading, like lots of books and journals. Yeah. That is kind of like a through line throughout Myst and Riven. But again, like there's all sorts of this diegetic in-game text that personal journals or Atris ruminating on these worlds he's created. Yet the only series I can think of that asks you to read more is probably like the Elder Scrolls. There's just a lot you can really you can sit down and be like, all right, I'm just going to spend the next 10 to 12 minutes just leafing through these 20, 30 pages of this in-game book I've stumbled across.
We just had a lot of writing, and one thing I wanted to say, I wanted to ask you actually, is if you some of the books, Gan's journal, and for me especially Catherine's journal, that you get like in the prison cell, they're a pretty long read, but to me this is generally cool. I like reading subplots and all that kind of stuff. But Catherine's journal was so infuriating to me because I felt it had a terrible handwriting. I mean, it looked nice, but it was so difficult to read for me. Like, I plowed through like 30, 40 pages, and there were so many times where I just couldn't tell what word this just is or what letter this just is. So that brought me to the brink of madness. Did you experience that similarly, or was it like just me being bad at reading?
I mean, I remember having some difficulty with it. It's a long time ago that I read it the first time. But I'm sure it's harder when English is not your first language in the first place.
I guess, yeah. Maybe.
But, I mean, it's not the best design that, like, you tend to get a hold of that book usually past the midpoint, and you just, like, you basically, I don't know, there's only really one piece of information you need in that. There's like a combination that you use later, and all the rest is just world building. So you could, if you wanted to, just leaf through until you see something useful and you're like, okay, cool, got it. But like most people, I think, just sit and end up reading it for like half an hour. You just
because you don't know what you need and what you don't, and you're gonna get stuck later, and you're like, maybe there's something in there, so I'm gonna read it, you know?
Yeah, Myst 3 actually had, like, they did the thing where it's like, oh, you know, there's a notebook, but pages of it are strewn around an age, so you read them in little chunks and it's broken up. And that sort of has the problem of like, why would these pages be strewn around? Why wouldn't they all be in one place? But
that's kind of
it
the
also makes it
Bioshock
so, like,
problem. Like,
yeah. But it at least is like, but it breaks up the information, so you're not just like, and pause the narrative to read for 40 minutes.
Yes, that's exactly what happened to me, and I just wanted to bring that handwriting up because it was infuriating. But okay, you wanted to say something before that. I interrupted you again. I hope you you can forgive me once again.
I'm going to debate a second forgiveness. But so, like, what's interesting to me, like the toy in the schoolhouse thingy, like, what's so great about it is how it serves so many different functions, right?
Yes.
Like, one, it's like, okay, it's a thing that teaches you the numbering system in a way that makes sense in this context. It does that. But also, like, it teaches you something about, like, it's this game about a person basically being sacrificed to a big fish. And you are in this little civilization that's, like, around the rim of a lake. And you meet, like, the fish monster. It's called the Wark. And it's this weird, like, fish/boar. And when you read Gen's journals, you understand that it's sort of this competitive thing of, like, oh, the Rivenese kind of worshipped the Wark before they knew about Gen. And so, like, the hanging people for it is, like, you actually find there's this thing that's the Wark gallows that is like this little cage with an opening on the bottom and a little thing that dangles people from it. And you can actually ride that thing up to the top.
True.
And later you find, like, Gen's little outpost where he, like, drops people. Like, he sacrifices people who cross him to the Wark. And you go you, like, see his underwater area where he actually, like, has these lights that go up that bring the Wark to different parts of the lake, because he actually has figured out, oh, if they worship the Wark, if I show that I can control the Wark, because the Wark is just a fish and it swims to wherever there's a light, and if I dangle a person, it's going to try to eat it, then, like, they're going to be like, oh, he must be a god because he controls our other god. And, like, just seeing that, like, he teaches this to the kids. They've got this, like, little toy that's all about, like, recognizing the validity of sacrificing people to the Wark. And so just, like, the way that it's like, oh, you get this useful piece of information and you learn so much about the world at the same time is just, it's beautiful.
It really is. I never even made that connection that he's controlling the Wark, to be honest.
That is like a major theme. I know I mentioned this before, but, like, you know, you can do a reading where, like, it's pretty much you've got a colonialist system Gen has set up. I think even in one of his journals, he talks about, you know, how, like, oh, this is a superstition of the villagers that I can exploit, you know, and it's right because I'm the guy with all this power and they're these mindless savages, so it's only right that I rule over them and make them, you know, believe the things songs, I believe. And I mean, the whole game, like of Riven, I should say, the whole themes of Riven are kind of about how like Gen tries to establish this little, Rudyard Kipling style colonial outpost for himself, but it can't hold, like it disintegrates. And the harder he tries to tighten his grip on it, writing his age or whatever, the quicker it falls apart. There is kind of that interesting through line to it that I actually haven't heard discussed all that much when I was doing research on Riven, like those kind of like post-colonial critique undertones of it. I thought that was really fascinating.
Well, I mean, I guess it gets sort of complicated because while you don't know the race of the main character, you are functionally a white savior.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
Atris is Gen's son, who's literally trying to do better. You don't really meet any of the Rivenese except Catherine, and Catherine's the one who's been, according to this metaphor, anglicized.
Isn't the guy you meet in the beginning that takes the book from you and gets darted to sleep, isn't he a Rivenese? And then
you have brief interactions with them, but you don't hold a conversation with anyone who doesn't like speak English to you,
True.
And that's partly just like economy, right? They're like, well, we can't do complex interactions in this engine we've built. So like you can really only talk to people who are like, you are trapped somewhere generally, like you are in a cage and a person is standing talking to you, and then for some reason they exit before you are free because they can't actually have you looking at characters from multiple angles.
Even though Riven adds something to Myst before, because what we said before is in Riven, in Myst, except for the very ending, you only interact through like these little windows, and I'm pretty sure that also had something to do with computing power, that like these films would be rendered in a very tiny frame so it wouldn't take up so much hard drive space on one CD.
Those are the only ones that ran without dropping frames when I played as well.
Exactly. And in Riven, they kind of also amped that up in the way that there are people on that island, because in Myst, you don't meet anyone in person. And in Riven, you do. There are sometimes these moments when you walk along a path, and then suddenly there was, for example, this one moment where suddenly there's a child in front of you. I think it's on the jungle island, and
it scares the crap out of you when it happens.
Still, like yesterday, I played this, and that was when I got to this point, and because you're so immersed in this game, and you don't anticipate somebody being physically in the space, and suddenly you walk to the next screen and this child is there, and I'm usually not very responsive when it comes to jump scares, but that scared the crap out of me.
And it's just like a little girl smiling at you, and then she like runs away, and I think she like trips.
And I mean, in a way, this even made this eeriness of Myst that I described earlier, for me at least, or apparently for you too, even a little more intense. Because there was suddenly this sense of danger. Like, there are people on this island, and in the beginning you see there's this, I think that's a, how do you pronounce it? The Dunny? No, the Dunny?
Dunny. Yeah.
I mean, is a Dunny.
It's not how you should pronounce it, but that's how people do.
Let's roll with it. So, like, that was a Dunny, I think, who darted this Rivenese in the beginning. So there's, like, a sense of danger. What if that happens to you? And I mean, it does happen to you later. You're gonna get darted to sleep as well. So there's more like a sense of urgency and danger, as opposed to in Myst, where you're not gonna meet anyone anytime.
You're very much made to feel like an outsider in Riven. Like, there are moments where you go through the Rivenese villages, and you can see there are people who like look and they're afraid of you, and they're like trying to go inside their hut and usher their family members inside, and like you definitely get the sense that you're not welcome there. Whereas with Myst, you're kind of like an explorer stumbling upon an unknown land, playing archaeologist. With Riven, you get the sense that I'm somewhere where this is not my place, and this is other people's place, and I'm almost kind of an intruder here, and it really does add that certain level of tension.
The thing that's never really resolved in the narrative of these games is like, is this world actually created by the person who writes the book? Like, in the books themselves, it is official canon that when you write a book, it's actually like, well, they take the premise that the universe is infinite. And so if you describe a particular place, all you're doing is creating a link because somewhere out in the vastness of the universe, that world must exist. and you are creating a link to that world. So no, you did not create these people. You're not a god to these people. You're just a traveler who has met them.
You just basically looked up a point in the infinite matrix of existence and linked to that, why it's called linking books. That's interesting.
So that's the premise.
Okay.
However, it doesn't really like stick to that because like obviously you can then make changes to the book and you see those changes in the world. Like while you're in Riven, Atris's changes that he's writing into the book are appearing around you. And it's like, well, we're not like connecting to a different universe now because I'm here. And like there's all these giant daggers all over Riven, and like all the Rivenese think like, oh, you know, this dagger, it has some significance. And Catherine's just like, nah, I wrote them into the book as a joke. And it's like, so what does that mean? Like are you connecting to a world and then you can control it? And like, I think in the end, it's just kind of a plot hole.
Yes.
Like they never really resolved that. It's like, well, we kind of want to have our cake and eat it too. But it does make this tension of like, okay, well, if you are creating this world, are you kind of a god? Because we've agreed like, no, that's colonialist and evil. Mm-hmm. But we still want to have the thing where you can make changes to the book and that world changes because of the changes you wrote. So,
Yeah, I think the point, like, you could still argue that it's like a multiverse, you know, that when Atris writes something in that book to alter it, that what actually happens is that it points to a different point in space-time where these parameters are set. But the one thing that kind of speaks against it is that basically you're in there and your consciousness remains in there. You know, we could go into transhumanism with that even.
I mean, also, does that mean when he alters the book and he goes to rescue his wife, it's actually a different wife?
Exactly.
Oh my God.
That's what I've been like. Yeah, that's a little bit.
It's the teleporter paradox, right? From Star Trek.
It is the
it's
teleporter
like,
paradox.
If I'm just reassembled in a different location, is that me or is it a copy of me? Does the me exist anymore?
That's what I meant by the consciousness thing, right?
Yeah.
Because if he would change to a different world, then you would not see it. You would remain in this point in space-time continuum, but he would think, hey, I just saved my wife, but it's actually a wife in some other place. And that's like a Rick and Morty thing here.
a little bit.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that puzzle you hate? I want to talk about that puzzle you hate.
The fire marble?
Okay.
I would love to talk about that puzzle I hate. Okay, now we can give it a little more context than before, because what we basically said is there are 5 different islands, and on one of these islands on many of these islands, there are these globes that you can open up, but on one of them you kind of encounter the first one, and in order to, am I right with that? In order to open it up, you have to, put these little marbles on a grid at the right positions. And these positions on the grid, they have to do with the placements of these globes on the island. And these placements you have to find out from a map room. And that's really, really far away.
So, literally, you're like going back and forth between this map room at the ass end of Riven, and then you're having to travel to each of these golden globes and figure out what their physical location is relative to this, piece of cartography you have in the map room. Then you have to trek back, take the colored marble that represents the globe on one portion of the island, put it in its right spot. And again, keep in mind, this is a 20 by 20 grid. So, having to like actually figure this puzzle out, I can't imagine like how many, confession, even the first time I played Riven, I had to look that one up because it would have just been too, I had no idea like even how to solve it. I think it was just so convoluted, at least to my, 12, 13-year-old mind at the time.
So the way, like, the premise of this puzzle is basically Gen has been trying to find some way to get off of Riven. And for a long time he was using this really complex process to try to because the art can only be done with a very particular type of paper. And he's trying to find some like chemical solution to make paper work in a certain way. Like he's deforested half of Riven trying to pulp all these trees into this particular type of paper.
And also needs a lot of energy, right?
Yeah, well, and so then he says, wait, maybe the paper is not the solution. Maybe I could pump some energy into them because I've got these fire bead thingies. And so he builds this, there's this gigantic dome on one of the major islands, like the central island. And he's got this little fire bead grid on it. And
Orichalcum.
and there's all yes, orichalcum. That's a topic for another day. But yes,
Yes.
but so like he's got these little domes, and each of these little domes is like spinning. And there's a little viewer you can look at the dome through, and when you look at it through the viewer, you can see like this symbol on it. And there's like this sequence of symbols that spin by, and if you push the button on top of the viewer when the right symbol goes by, which again was very difficult for me because it dropped frames.
Oh, yeah.
And so I basically had to click like half a second in advance of when the thing would appear. Then
You
the
still
dome
have
will
to do
open up.
that without it dropping frames.
Yeah, then the dome will open up, and there's a little linking book to a new age that Gen has written. And if you want to catch Gen, you've got to go through this. But the book is not powered up, and so you've got to power it up by, like, you go to this grid thing, and you can send power to that dome by putting the bead of the appropriate color, and the bead color associates with the symbol that opened that dome in the first place, on this grid that represents all the different islands in the spot of that dome, and then you send power to it. And I think you have to send power to all the domes at once for any of them to open up.
Yep.
So, like, it requires a lot of different information, right? Like, you learn which colors go with those symbols when you're underground looking at the wark, and, like, you turn on the lights and the wark swims to different places, but you see, this symbol goes with that color. Cool. And, like, I think you have to learn the Dunny writing system at some point as well. And when you go to the map space, like, first you have to see, like, okay, all these symbols, these represent each of the different islands. You can see that by looking at this overhang thing. And then you go over, and then you go to this different map, and you can, like, bring up smaller sections of the islands in this big topographical thing. And by looking at that, you can see where each dome is. Now, if you know what you're trying to do in advance, you can just do what you'll probably be doing anyway, which is take out your notebook and, like, mark down where on each grid everything is. But if you don't know that at first, then you're just doing this really long, tedious back and forth. And again, I don't know if this puzzle is fair. I don't know if it's reasonable to expect this of people. I played Riven again, like, a couple years ago for the first time in 15 years, and playing the game cold, but having beaten it many, many years ago is kind of the ideal way to play it, because you don't remember the solutions, but you have, like, inklings. There's this, like, I think it's something, I have kind of an idea.
You know the mindset it expects from you to solve it.
Yeah. You know what to pay attention to. And so then you, like, get the experience that I think they're going through, which is like, I recognize this. Is this that? And, like, I think I need to put these beads here. And when you play it that way, solving that puzzle is incredibly satisfying. But I have no idea how many people actually solved it that way, or if you can only solve it that way if you solved it with a walkthrough 15 years earlier, which is what I did.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point.
But, like, it is just, it's this feeling of, like, understanding all of these different mechanics of how this world operates. And once you get, like, you're not just like, here's a thing I have to do. You're like, this is a thing Gen has done in order to achieve this thing. And that feeling of, like, basically having to walk through his footsteps and understand his motivations, like, it stitches you into the world in this really beautiful way that's really hard to do.
I think you just mentioned my favorite thing about these games, because you said that solving this puzzle in this way was incredibly satisfying. And I can still say, I said this puzzle was really infuriating, but I stood through it until I, made all these connections. And the moment I realized this is, I'm on the right track right now, and then it came together and it worked, it was incredibly satisfying. Like
that light bulb going off moment.
I remember making a video on Abduction. I don't know who of you has played Abduction, which is like,
I have Abduction, but I need to upgrade my OS before it'll run. So, like, please no spoilers. I'm very excited.
No, I'm just saying, like, Abduction I made a video on it, and it has the same kind of mind-blowing discovery at some point that feels really satisfying. And what I just want to say in this video, I say it feels like a cerebral orgasm, because you have these many different, that they're connected pieces of information, but you don't yet know how, and you try to pay attention to them. And I keep comparing that to when you travel to a new city you've never been to before, then the map in your mind is kind of like a fog of war. and you find one place and you find another place, and in your mind map there are places that are set apart, and at some point you find out like, oh, they're connected like this, and suddenly these two pieces of map information in your mind, they combine themselves together to a big coherent piece of information. And that's kind of the way the puzzles in Myst and especially Riven, and especially the way these puzzles are woven into the world building come together, because suddenly everything makes sense, and it's like everything is suddenly falling into place, and you go from one aha moment to the next, because you're like, oh my god, and yes, they mentioned this earlier, now it makes sense. And that's what these games build up for. That's basically what I love most about them. That's why I also love Abduction, because they brought this very feeling back.
Yeah, I was really surprised to hear that Abduction does that, because Riven was the last Myst game that both the Miller brothers worked on. Robin left Cyan to do his own thing after that, and the next two Myst games weren't even made by Cyan, and then they came back and did Myst 5, but without Robin. And Robin did the music for Abduction, but I don't think he worked on the design at all. And Robin's sensibilities were much more like he and Rand kind of made Myst together, but it was him and there was this third guy whose name I don't remember that they brought in. I think he was like a guy who'd worked in movies for a while, and they brought him in. It was the two, Robin and this other dude basically designed Riven themselves, and they wanted to really push this, how deeply can we embed our puzzles into our narrative? How much can we give you that feeling of solving a puzzle is not just solving a puzzle, it's learning how a world works, and it's learning how characters think and feel.
Yeah.
And that, if you understand the world, if you understand the motivations of the character, the puzzle makes perfect sense, and you've, walked in that other character's shoes in order to solve it. And that's, to me, that's, the best kind of adventure game design. And I don't know any game that pushes it that far other than Riven.
Yes, I completely agree. I heard about Abduction, and I was kind of very eager to play it at some point, but I was also a little skeptical, as you always are with remakes of old classics, and I was afraid that they would not be able to bring back this kind of feeling. And I remember what brought me to finally play Abduction, because I saw it was Mark Brown, Game Maker's Toolkit. He tweeted at some point yeah, I've been playing Abduction a while, and it was good. And now you do this. Oh my god, Abduction is did they do it? Did they make it? And I started playing it, and 10 hours into the game, at some point I had the same moment I had with Riven before, and I didn't have that in any game ever since. So that's basically the
puzzle catharsis.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, absolutely. Yeah. Very, very satisfying.
Cerebral orgasm. I think we can use either.
I like that. Yeah, that's,
interchangeable terms.
It's gonna be my go-to now.
Oh, glad I've coined something in my non-native language there.
Well done. Well done.
No, very cool. So do you remember solving that puzzle back in the day in a similar way, Michael?
The fire marble. Yeah. I remember I remember starting to get an inkling about I discovered the thing that the colors corresponded to the different symbols, and so I was at that point I was able to get it in my head that okay, this I clearly need to match them to their point on the grid. But I don't know if my spatial reasoning skills weren't as developed back then or whatever, but the first time I played the game, I remembered for a solid day, I want to say I played for 4, 5, 6 hours straight, a shameful amount of time. I tried to go back and forth and arrange the beads in the correct place, and I just couldn't get it, even taking as careful and copious notes as I could. So eventually, yeah, I fired up the modem, logged on to AOL, and I looked up a walkthrough for that one.
Yeah.
But as far as I can recall, that was the only puzzle I had to use a hymn book to solve. I don't think there were any others that tripped me up quite that much.
I don't think there's any shame in that.
Well, like I said, I think there's only 3 puzzles in the game.
True.
Kind of,
true.
Yeah.
They're big and sprawling, and they involve a whole lot of interlocking parts. But ultimately, there's You do the fire beads. You figure out how to get to like the moiety age, which is where all the rebels are hiding out. And then you open the star fissure, and that's kind of it.
Well, yeah, on the other hand, you have like these sub puzzles, I would say. Like for instance, when you start out, there's this rotating room that, every time you push a button, the room rotates like a fifth, and it only has 2 exits, but you have 2 entrances, and you have to figure out how to get over and how to open it up so you can get through all the time. So this is like a puzzle in and of itself, but it's also, part of the bigger Firebeat puzzle in a way, because it...
Yes.
Yeah, and it's also like it seems like a complex puzzle, but it's actually surprisingly straightforward when you start messing with it.
And that's also a thing that I love about these games, is that they get easy and solvable and also very satisfying when you start taking physical notes.
Yes.
Those are some of those games where you really have to take paper and write shit down, and you have maybe you write down information that you won't need later, but you have like kind of this compendium of the information you find, and that once again goes back to this archaeological discovery thing that you go through, and you don't really know, okay, do I need this? But I'm going to pin it down. Maybe this will tell me something later on.
I had that exact moment playing through Myst, where early on, to get to the other ages, you have to rotate, a lighthouse so that it's pointing to whatever world you want to enter, and then it reveals to you a little hint about how to get into this world. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, ooh, I got to get out my little notebook here. I'm going to like start taking down notes, like really play detective, play archaeologist. There's something so incredibly satisfying about that. It's not just a question of like, okay, I have this little bit of information and now I just needed to take this somewhere else for 15 seconds and then use it to solve the puzzle. Like the game really gives you a lot that you kind of have to absorb and process and kind of sift through what's useful for this puzzle, what's useful for this puzzle, and then kind of sort it out. And it really does give you that element of satisfaction where it's like, okay, I've actually solved a puzzle here.
Andrew Plotkin, he's a text adventure writer. He's like a local here in Boston. He did a Kickstarter a few years ago for this game Hattie and Lands, and it was like early in the days of Kickstarter, and he was like the biggest interactive fiction writer ever to succeed on Kickstarter.
Okay.
And he does these reviews on his website of like, and they go back a really long ways. Like I'm pretty sure some are copy pasted from old like message boards from like pre-internet.
Real
so he's been
BBS
like,
hours, yeah.
Yeah, so he's been like reviewing these adventure games like for basically the entire history of adventure games, and one of the things he always includes for like particularly tough ones is here's how many pages of notes this game took.
Oh, that is so cool.
Yeah.
That is a good idea, actually.
Yeah, and he's like, let's see, well, originally it was 10 pages, but then I had to consolidate, and once I consolidated them, it was only 8.
That's very interesting. And how many pages does Myst or respectively Risen get in his reviews? Do you know that?
I would have to go back and look. I think when he reviewed Riven, he was like, I'm reviewing a game from several years ago, so I didn't take as many notes this time.
Okay. Yeah, because that's a point I wanted to get to, because, I mean, generally, most adventure games, puzzles, like especially classic adventure games puzzles and Myst-Likes, just as in LucasArts likes, once you solve these games, the satisfaction doesn't come a second time because you know it all, right? And I think for for all of us, we played these games back in the day, and then a long time later, which is, as you said already, it's probably one of the best ways to experience them, because over time the vital parts to solving all these puzzles has been erased from your memory. I kind of wish I could do that with Monkey Island and play it over again.
Yeah,
right?
It's impossible. I've played that game so many times.
Yeah, I can tell you the entire walkthrough from memory, no problem. Like right here.
Yeah, I probably could.
Yeah, and I've been dreaming so often about this. Man, if I had a machine like like the MIB stick, like the lightning stick that erases your memory.
The neuralizer,
right?
Yes.
But only you could point it towards all the information regarding Monkey Island, and then it's like poof, and go again. That would be it.
Right. I want the machine from Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, but only so that I can reappreciate my video games with a fresh mind every single time.
I mean, clearly the ideal way is to not entirely erase the memory, but just make it kind of fuzzy.
Yeah.
So that you can sort of be like, I think I do something with these beads.
Yeah, and as you said, that's basically achieved by not playing the game for a couple of decades and then getting back to it. So
Yeah, so I look forward to playing Riven again when I'm 45.
Oh my god. Oh, this is closer than I would like it to be, actually.
Yeah.
Tangent.
Yeah, tell me about it.
But we're already, I think this is the longest podcast we've done so far. And I was actually wondering earlier how many people who have never played Myst or Riven we lost along this podcast, because I think it got a
right around
little
minute 15. Yeah.
I think it got a little obtuse at some point. I mean,
I think there's a lot to cover with these games. You know, the design, the storytelling, the cultural impact. Like, these are important games. So if you have made it all the way to the end, dear listener, and you're still with us, you know, please play these games. They're really like an important part of gaming history. They still hold up. You know, they're Blast from the Past certified. We've replayed them recently, and we can say that, you know, they still hold up. So give them a shot, because they're well worth your time.
yeah, it's kind of
Word of advice if you're going to play Riven: if you see a lever that looks like it pulls in one direction, check to see if it pulls in the other direction as well.
Yes.
And if you open a door, close it behind you. I just saved you 5 hours of frustration.
even more, maybe. That's true. Okay, before we're about to wrap this up, I guess, but is there anything any one of you want to still get out of there, wants to talk about with Myst or Riven? Or
I've heard Myst 4 is pretty good. I still haven't played it.
me neither, actually.
Neither have I. Yeah, I've played 1, 2, 3, never played 4 or 5, and I definitely Abduction is on my to play list as well.
I must confess that I haven't even played 3. 3 is the 360 one, right?
Yes.
It's the first 360 one, yeah. By which we mean 360 degrees rotation, not that it was on the Xbox 360.
Oh, true. Yeah, exactly. Well, whereas in Myst and Riven, you have these static screens and you click on hotspots, and in Myst 3, they kind of made you turn 360 degrees at every hotspot you stand on. That's basically it. And I've never played that. Is it recommendable too? Ian, you played it, I think?
It's not bad. There is one age that I think is great.
Okay.
I think it's the most disposable Myst game. It's sort of like, first of all, it doesn't really explain, because like at the end of Riven, you go back to your own world.
Right.
And there's no explanation in Myst 3 how the hell you got back to Atris. And then basically the plot is just like, oh, a thing happens, and then you fix it, and that's the end of that. Like, it doesn't really have much impact on the future of the universe. It doesn't really like extend from any of the past of the universe. It's one of those sequels, like I think the Monkey Island series kind of does the same thing, where like you have a first game in a series and it does really well, and then you have a second game in the series that kind of takes the first as a jumping off point and does something that's like kind of different,
true.
but also expands on it. And then all the other sequels just treat the first game as a template and kind of ignore the design of the second game.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's because Ron Gilbert was gone.
Yeah, Myst 3 is very much a sequel to Myst, not a sequel to Riven.
Interesting.
Yeah, most definitely.
That's interesting. Yeah, with Monkey Island, it was basically that until this point, only Ron Gilbert knows the actual plot of Monkey Island 3, while the Monkey Island 3 that we got, he always calls it like a Monkey Island 3A.
Yeah.
And he still says, like, as soon as I get, like, the license from Disney, I'm going to make it. But yeah, that's a tangent. One thing that I noticed replaying Riven, and we just talked about the ending. So what basically happens is you free Catherine, and then Atris comes, and they both go back to their age with the linking book, and then they kind of leave you there, and you fall into the fissure that you just reopened.
Yep.
And I always
Right.
found that is
Full
kind
circle.
of a dick move by Atris, because he just assumes, everything is going to be all right. Like the final sentence really reads, I'm gonna read this here. I got the quote. Now I understand. Endings and beginnings are within the fissure, that riven cleft of stars that acts as both wall and a bridge. And though I am unable to understand how, the very flow of stars that brought my Myst book into my worthy hands, I am sure served as a safe passage home for my friend. So he just assumes, I'm pretty sure that it's going to be fine if I push him down this rift into nothingness. Like, he's going to be fine, no problem. And I always thought, like, dude, I just saved your wife after 30 years of struggle, and you push me down a cliff. That's kind of mean.
Well, it is. So the thing about like the main character is they come to Myst with no way back home, and that star fissure is the only possible way for you to get back home. So it is sort of like, well, hope everything's going to be okay, but the alternative is I never go home again. So I guess it's defensible, but it is like, we don't know how far you have to fall before you get back to Earth.
Yeah, and then eventually he comes to the conclusion that he says, like, and now I am at rest, understanding that in books and ages and life, the ending can never truly be written. And that basically goes so wonderfully full circle. Also with you know, the idea that Michael proposed that this whole universe is built on the idea of imagination captured within tomes of wisdom, books, you know.
Yes.
And something I deeply related to as a kid because I loved reading and reading and reading every book that I could get because it was like a gateway into another world in my mind. And in the end, this was really the last sentence uttered in Riven. And it basically says, yep, this is really what it's about. It's about this. There is never an end, and you can venture into any kind of world you can imagine if you just know how. Like, if you just have the fantasy to do it, you know. And I kind of like this going full circle with this idea, even though there's a lot of extra plot to, you know, embellish everything. To me, it still comes down to this is a trip into imagination.
Yeah.
Come with me, and you'll be. Seriously though, that's it. That is exactly what it is. It's this wonderful idea that like there are infinite worlds out there that we are able to open ourselves to and enter if we're just able to approach it with the right state of mind. And isn't that kind of like what reading and computer games and every other wonderful form of escapism, isn't that kind of what it's all about? It's about the act of kind of like willingly putting yourself in a state of mind where you can be emotionally moved and taken to an entirely different world.
I think there's a better way to end this podcast, honestly.
Nope, you nailed it.
Absolutely, man.
Wow.
Yeah, let's wrap this up. Ian, thank you so much for joining us for this. It was really a blast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was our pleasure. And with that, we still haven't worked on an ending sentence, so we just resolved to saying bye, I guess. I hope you guys enjoy Myst and Riven, and bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.